Okay.
Great, thank you. So, we're going to talk a lot, and mostly this is for me, so I can go back and listen to what you're saying to try and pull out stuff for conversation. So try as best you can to ignore all this stuff on the right. But what I will get you to do is say thank you. Well, I'll say thank you so much for joining us. And can you introduce yourself for the camera?
Can I?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I am Tricia Wallace. Then my mother's name was Annie Jane Colson. She married Sturgis, and then I married Wallace. So the Wallace side of the family is very easily traceable because it has a long history.
It does.
But the Irish side is very difficult to trace because the records were all burnt and done away with. So I've been very interested in the Irish side.
A lot of them were burnt intentionally. It's a very good way to become popular is to burn all the tax records if you're having a rebellion. So when you look back at your history, you found that you were from Monaghan.
From Fermanagh.
Fermanagh.
Mm-hmm.
So talk a little bit about that.
Well, she's regarded fondly, I think, by the family, but also as a rebel. She did not intend the life on a dairy farm in a thatched cottage, and she moved as a young girl to Belfast and apprenticed herself to a very well-known Robinson and Cleavers were the name of the store.
Robinson and Cleavers.
They made the blouses that were made by the millions for the long-skirted outfits they wore in those days. And Mother learned to be a cutter and designer of these blouses.
So when would that have been? What years?
I have to think about it, but she came to us. I'd
That's
have to
okay.
look up my records.
That's
I
okay.
have them. I have researched it.
So-
And then she decided that she wanted to do more than that, and she applied for a position as a cutter and designer that was advertised in the paper in Sydney, Australia, and never got a reply. But 4 years later, when that person that they'd chosen left, they looked through their applicants and said, "Would you like to come?" So out she went at 28 in the start of World War II. When there really was, it was 1918, which is when it started. And the ship was followed by a submarine all across the Indian Ocean,
Wow.
which didn't seem to worry Mother at all. She was the only beautiful person on the ship going out to Australia. And she had a ball. I mean, very, very strictly brought up. So she finally arrived in Sydney and got a place in a boarding house. And when she wrote the address back to her Irish family, they thought she'd gone to the Aborigines. It was Ulladulla, Arabella Street, Kirribilli. And they had meals there and slept there. And she said to the waiter, "If a man comes to this place with large eyes and small feet, put him at my table." And that was my father. I can't imagine that as a way of choosing it.
That's what she said.
That's what she said. So the eyes are not Irish, they're my father's English eyes. And they've gone strongly through the family ever since, the wide-spaced eyes.
So
And
she was working in she was apprenticed in the
She
renowned linen of Belfast, and that's what she
Yes.
did when she went to Australia.
She was designing the blouses, but they were very known for their linens, you know. And she got a job doing the same thing in Australia. And then she met my father, and he went away to war for 4 years, you know. And he set her up in business, to run her own business. And he was very surprised when he came home to find that it had made no profit at all. Mother said, I don't know. Sure, I don't know how he could say that. Sure, I was dressed like a queen. She ate up all the profits, but she looked gorgeous. and
Priorities.
and so anyway, when the ships came into harbour, we had a friend who was the harbour master in Sydney Harbour. He ran the tugs that brought the big ships into the pier. And he asked Mother if she'd like to go out on the ship and on the tug and meet the ship that was coming in with my father. He knew nothing about this. And she was calling up with his name, and he was down packing in the cabin. And somebody went down and said, if I had a beautiful Irish colleen waiting down on the tug, I would be up on deck. So up he went on deck to meet her, surprised that her beautiful Irish blue eyes had faded in 4 years of Australian sun. Isn't that funny? Just, she no longer had those brilliant blue eyes.
So, you yourself moved from Australia. When did you move?
We moved when I married my husband. We moved to New Zealand, Wellington, New Zealand, for 6 years, built our first home there, and then were offered a transfer to the head office in Detroit. I think everybody wore black armbands in those days. Detroit was really murder city of the United States, you know. But they were very, very kind to us, coming from so far away. And
How long did you live there?
lived there for 11 years, and then he was asked to start the business in Switzerland. So
And this was all with,
all with the Burroughs Adding Machine Corporation.
and what, do you remember what years they were in Detroit?
Yes, he was there from 1954. We were there for just 6 years that time, because we came back to Detroit. And we were there until 1960, when we had to make a decision about becoming
Right.
American citizens, which we happily did. I mean, it was a bit hard to give up your native land.
Mhm.
It's
We all know on this side. There's three heads all nodding.
Yes.
The Australian, the Belarusian, and the Irish person on this
Yeah, I
side of the
know.
interview.
It's hard because you never lose that. I mean, my husband fought for the Queen and marched down Martin Place at the head of his troops, and even now I sing all these beautiful American anthems, but not my country, 'tis of thee. That was our anthem, that tune.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't sing that without tears.
So when you were in Detroit, that was the real start of the Motor City, wasn't it? The 50s? Was that the time it really began to get very large as a...
Well, it was a boom in the Motor
Yeah.
City, and I don't think my husband would be able to believe that Japan wrecked that car industry. I mean, for the good in the long run, but yeah, so it was a lot of change.
So from there you went to Switzerland.
We went to Fribourg and put our children into French-speaking schools, so they were not in classy, high-class Swiss schooling, as they call it. You know. This was the local schools, and they learnt to speak only in Switzerland, in Swiss, except home, and only in French. We could have put them in the German. We were right on the border. But even the German Swiss don't speak German. They learn it, but they speak Schweizerdeutsch.
Freiburg or Freiburg? Is it?
The half of the town that was German was Freiburg. The other half was Fribourg.
Freiburg.
And so we had some very interesting experiences over there. We decided that we were in a totally Catholic city. We paid taxes to support the Catholic Church and everything. The schools were Catholic, everything. They were the Swiss guards that guarded the Pope. And so I decided that we needed to have a Protestant presence of some sort, and we advertised for Protestants. And nobody replied except the minister from Lausanne, who was a Scot. And he said, "You're advertising in the middle of summer, they're all gone on vacation, let's try it again." So we did, and we got 70 people turn up, not all, different angles of Protestantism. And he said, "You'll never keep all of those. A lot of them are traditional Episcopalians, you know, and they're not going to join up with a Scottish church." Anyway, we were great friends with Andrew. And the thing that surprised me, after they'd been meeting at my house, I'd been feeding them and all the boys that came for confirmation for about 4 years, and he said to me, "I do think it is time for me to give you the only thing we Scots feel we really have to give, and that's our first name." Now, isn't that interesting? Americans are so free with that first name, and I would like you to call me Andrew. And I've never been more honoured, because it was not a small gesture for him.
So you then came back to America, back to Detroit, was it?
We came back to Detroit and spent the next 11 years there. We were 17 years total there. And then he retired, and by then the children had all gone through colleges, they'd met their future husbands. There was absolutely no way we would fit in back at Australia with the children, you know. So we decided we would look around, and we chose North Carolina. We went down to Florida. Jeff and I walked the beach on the Tampa side and said, "Where are all the people? This is supposed to be a very big vacation type." And we went back home and we lay on the bed to discuss this. And I said, "I think they're all sleeping." And Jeff said, "What do you think we're doing?" "We'll be the same if we stay here." So we moved north. It was too hot.
So it's an interesting thing you say, and I think we probably all feel the same way. Once you've been away for a number of years, you don't feel like you belong even back there.
You're right. I find going back to Australia, which I love with all my heart, that my family, I can't speak for all of you, are very bigoted. Not the way most Americans are here, you know. And it's something I think, well, what am I out here for? I'm out here for the family. I will not say a word in argument, because they're good Irish heritage, and they will argue at the drop of a hat forever. So
There's that quote I just heard the other day, and being Irish I can say it, there's an Irish amnesiac, forgets everything but their grudges.
yes.
which is sad but true.
Yeah.
So, having travelled around so much, when you think about yourself, and this is a terrible question to ask you because I don't know the answer for me, so how do you think of yourself, both as a world citizen, and do you think of yourself as Australian, do you think of yourself as, you know, Irish?
Well, we never thought of ourselves as British. Australia was always very independent, but we're very close to the Queen and everything else. Now, when World War II broke out, millions joined up immediately. My husband did. They couldn't cope with they were not a draft. They were just volunteers. And they already met at the big Sydney showground, where they were given their uniforms and sent home for the night. And every morning I packed him a lunch in a brown paper bag, and in his army uniform I sent him off to war, and he came back at night. That because they didn't have the camps or anything. Well, I don't think they do that now to support Britain.
What was his name?
Jeff.
Jeff.
Edward Geoffrey, G-O-F-F-R-E-Y.
And
Wallace.
where did he serve? Was that in the Asia Pacific?
He served in Alamein against, it was
Rommel.
a 5-year war for him, against Rommel. I still have the things he carved at workshops they were provided with out of Stuka propellers. It's the
Wow.
first time they lay on the sands
Wow.
and watched the dogfights and could see they were winning them and not losing them. And then in the next day, they would go out and pick up the Stuka, cut off a hunk of Stuka propeller, and I have a letter opener and a butter knife, a few things made out of those.
The Stuka collection.
Yeah,
Just swapping back for a second, your grandfather, when he signed up for the First World War,
yes.
Did he
He
serve?
was a signalman.
was he in Gallipoli?
He was what?
Was he in Gallipoli?
No. No, we've never forgotten the British or Churchill for that.
Well, my grandfather was there, which is why I asked. And
Yeah.
obviously, the anniversary of Gallipoli is Anzac Day, isn't it?
Yeah, that is
Anzac Day.
Anzac.
That's Anzac Day.
Mm.
Questions, Greg? Anna? Okay.
Did your husband serve in Tobruk at all?
What's
To
that?
Brooke.
Was he at Tobruk at all? You said he was at El Alamein. Did he?
He was at my husband was
Your
at
husband.
El Alamein, and he contracted jaundice and was put to one of the hospitals in the Nile. I mean, he lived it up there. And then when Pearl Harbor happened, all we could think of was relief.
Yes.
You know, we'll get some help in this now.
Yes.
And they brought them home. But the only way of transporting the Australian troops to Africa and back was on the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth.
That's right. That's right.
And they were camouflaged, and you never knew. We'd go over the Sydney Harbour Bridge so you could look down on all the ships, and suddenly this great big camouflage ship would come in, and you'd know the troops were going. And they were escorted out of Sydney Harbour by a convoy and right round to Perth, and then they were let loose. They were faster than any convoy, and they zigzagged across the harbour. They were 3 men to a bed.
Wow.
You slept in it for 8 hours, and then you
Oh, that's
had
right.
to stay upstairs
Mhm.
on the boat.
They're on watch.
For
They're on
the
sleeping
reality.
watch. That's right.
And if it had been hit, they had no way
Yeah.
of saving them.
So as we get towards the end, there's a couple of things I want to make sure that I put in. The first is, we were talking about it, and the Irish blessing, may the road rise to meet you.
Yes.
May the wind be ever at your back, and until we meet again, may God keep you safe in the palms of his hands. Can you talk a bit about what you were talking about earlier about that?
Well, I was at church and I saw one of our ministers and I said, I'd like you to do my funeral service because you're good at births and deaths.
Both ends.
So he said, that's a good idea, let's have lunch. And he took me to lunch, and I knew it was to write my obituary. He's a wonderful guy, we had a lot of fun. But I also thought, well, I'd better have him with a copy of the funeral service, and that was one of the things I insisted we have on the back, was that Irish
Yes.
blessing. I think it is really unique. and
Oh, it's beautiful.
beautiful.
And then you were talking about the song that your mother used to sing that I didn't know,
No.
but I'll look it up, so I want you to, for the
Well,
tape.
I've got a copy of it there, because I did eventually find it. We went to my daughter was transferred with her husband over to Malahide,
Mhm.
out of Dublin.
I know it very well.
Yes. And she said, Mum, come on over for 2 weeks and we'll find the old cottage. So we went over, I went over there for 2 weeks, and we did everything around Ireland, Northern Ireland. It was just amazing. Never forget it. And then before we went home, we went to the highest pub in Ireland. Which mountains did you say they were?
Wicklow, that would be the Wicklow Mountains.
We
Well, they call them the Dublin Mountains, but they're actually in Wicklow.
Yes.
Carrantoul, it'll be.
And we went up to this pub, and it was a wonderful Irish thing. They were singing all the Irish songs. And a lot of them were about the dreaded sentence of being sent to Van Diemen's Land. which is the state of Tasmania.
There goes half of the songs that I was going to do on the 11th, by the way, if I have to take Van Diemen's Land out of it.
Save them for that. And they were all dirges about no hope, and they were right, you know. Van Diemen's Land was awful. But I'd had about enough of this, and as I went out, went up to the band as we passed and thanked him and said how much we'd enjoy it, but I married a man from Van Diemen's Land, and they're not demons. Although my sons think, though, the only thing that comes out of Tasmania is the devil. The Tasmanian devil, so. But
The song that your mother used to sing that you remember, what's
yes,
it called?
the Fill the Fluter's Ball.
Fill the Fluter's Ball. I will look it up.
I've got
Because
a
it's one
copy
that I
of it
haven't-
there, because we did find it with the toot on the flute and the twiddle on the fiddle, hoy, hopping in the middle like a heron on a griddle, up and down, hands around, facing to the wall, hadn't we the gaiety at Fill the Fluter's Ball?
So, and the band didn't know it either, in my defence.
They
right?
didn't know.
They didn't know.
So then I told my daughter, and she said, "Oh, Mum, it must be somewhere." And she finally online found a book that had it in it.
So as we wrap up, Olga, anything?
No, I'm
Greg?
thinking.
Greg, anything? As we think about it, is there anything else that you think, oh, I'd like to say that before we finish? I mean, there may not be. I just always ask, just in case there's like, oh, I meant to say that. And
Well, one thing was that Mother dressed like a queen, and she married a prominent businessman, and all that went in the Depression. We owned our home, or we'd have been on the street. Mother went back to her Irish roots, grew the vegetables, and she had always friends around, and my English father was hard to get along with. And he said to once when we had the group of friends all around, an Englishman's home is supposed to be his castle, and you have made it a den of thieves. And they were all the den of thieves around the table. Well, the den of thieves still came, but we were heavy on vegetables and not much meat. And Mother went down to sewing her own things, doing it, but we still went to a lake for 2 weeks of the year for a vacation. Mother, Daddy wanted no part of this, too English to go into that awful group. So we left, and we carried a cabin trunk and all the sailboats and cricket bats and everything else that we needed, and a bunch of friends, and we took off with Mother. We got a taxi, which we only did once a year, to the station. The boys carted the cabin trunk up the stairs, across the bridge, down onto the station, where we waited for the commuter train to take us to the end of the line. And then we got up and across and down to the commuter, and Mother brought out all the cards and everything to keep us
okay.
controlled until we went for another hour up to Wyong Station, which is nothing. We got off that into a little motorboat. Up came the trunk and everything else, and we took that little boat down the Wyong Creek, across the river to the other side. No bridge across, so we had to bring everything. And then we hefted the thing down to a cinder block cabin with with an open fire. And Mother loved it. How we could have such fun when it was all work for her, I don't know, but it was wonderful. And she, once every week, would have to row across to the other side on the only channel across the shallow lake, where all the fishermen were lined up along the sides with their rods out or throwing in, and Mother was zigzagging up with all the sailboats out the back, and all the children with yelling and shouting. And finally she stood up in the boat and called to the fishermen, "Would you mind getting out of my way because I can't get out of yours.
And did they?
And they did. They did not. And we went to the other side and back.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you. I think we're good.
It
Thank
was
you
just
so-
the way her life changed from
being.
riches to rags
Mhm.
and back to her Irish beginnings. And we never had
But she
any-
was always comfortable the whole way through, though. She was always self-possessed,
very.
a rebel. But she made her own way. She made her own way to
Her own
Australia, and
And she told us that if we did our best, we were better than average, because most people don't. And she criticised us terribly, but not to us. We were just, oh, sure dear, you're a credit to old Ireland.
you feel a very strong sense of Irishness, don't you?
Oh, yes, she was unforgettable.
But it's not just your mother, but it's also you personally feel a strong sense of Irish belonging.
Yes, and it's because of her. I
And
mean,
is your daughter still there in Malahide?
No, they were downsized by Coca-Cola Company when they put off 6,000 across the world, and he came back and
Okay.
went into.
It's a strange thing to think about for me, to think about people moving to Ireland for work, being downsized and having to go back home to Australia. So something feels very strange about it.
It's very strange.
Just the other way
And
around.
Northern Ireland was thriving as part of the European Common Union, and we went to Keats' birthplace, and it was all remodelled and
Mm.
I mean, cleaned
Yep.
and up to date and everything. That gorgeous thatched cottage that had been enlarged, we went through it. I told them everything I remembered about it, and I said, in here was the living room, the lounge, and they said, do you want to see that? And they opened the door, and it was farm equipment.
So you went there from Australia when you were 8.
Yes.
That must have been a long trip
Oh, yes, it took 3 weeks.
to get there, and then you were there for 4 weeks. We're running way over, but
Oh.
I'm interested.
And the whole side of the
What?
house was buckling.
What was the? How did it come about that you went there? Because it's months. So you went there with your mother and
No,
father,
what
or just-
happened was my father was sent out by the corporation to help install the Sydney Telephone Exchange. War broke out. He joined the Australian forces because he couldn't get back to do the British thing. And they owed him a trip back. So he and the family went back and he deposited us in Ireland.
With the
and
relations.
went back to London to do his thing and came over and picked us
Brilliant.
up. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're good. Thank you so much. Just take your time. We'll pause that.
Actually, if you could just stay there, I just want to get a wide shot of you still
Mhm,
having
sure.
a conversation.
So, wait.